Greetings. In this mini lecture, we turn away from history, where we've been for a while, and we move to the second component of Britain, which is British institutions, introduction, and monarch. So I want to begin by talking about five major ideas that underlie British politics. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, it could be much longer. But to me, these five kind of stand out in terms of ideas that we're going to touch on in multiple places and that really show a contrast with the American presidential system. So, in terms of just a summary statement about history, that's really where I started, where your notes say British political history is essentially a struggle to shift political power from the monarch, from the king or queen, to a national legislature, the parliament, and some call the parliament the House of Commons, which is representative and accountable to ordinary people. And certainly in the series of mini lectures on British history, I did, I think, demonstrate that over the centuries, the British system has been transformed from an incredibly strong monarch to one in which the monarch and the parliament were in kind of a balance, to where they were eventually equal, to where the parliament became much stronger, but the king still had significant powers, to today, a constitutional monarchy, where the powers of the monarch are now totally informal. I stole this summary statement. I told you earlier that most of the things that are really good in this course I've stolen. And this statement is again from John Foles. You may remember him, the guy that earlier said Britain a country with only its past to live for. But he said more than any modern state, Britain has preserved the traditions and the institutions of its monarchical past while placing them in a democratic context. This statement is summarized by King Farouk, and if you're not familiar with King Farouk, he was the king of Egypt. Ironically, he said this shortly before Abdul Nasser overthrew him. But in 1951, he was asked the question, what is the future of monarchies? And he said, I don't believe that the future of monarchies is very good in the future of the world. In fact, he said, I envisioned, and here's where the quote starts, I envision there will soon only be five kings left in the world: the kings of spades, clubs, diamonds, hearts, and England. And so essentially, King Farouk was saying, if there is any group of people in the world that will cling to the notion of monarchy, it is in England. And I think that that is a nice way to kind of end the historical discussion. And so I then moved on to five what I called seminal, you may want to call them important, essential ideas that really underlie the British political system. So the first is parliamentary sovereignty. So in the United States, there is constitutional supremacy. The U.S. Constitution is supreme over ordinary acts of the Congress and ordinary acts of the state legislatures. And of course, that's what John Marshall, for those of you who took American government, you may remember that statement from the landmark case of Marbury versus Madison, where Marshall ruled in this particular case that Marbury's lawsuit was illegal, that Congress had tried to change the Constitution with an ordinary act of the Congress, that the Constitution could not be modified or amended by the Congress unless it was through the amendment process. And so the Constitution is supreme, or ultimate sovereignty is in the Constitution. In Great Britain, I listed a couple other countries too, Israel, New Zealand. There is no written constitution. So in Great Britain, if Parliament passes a law, there is no Supreme Court to declare it illegal or unconstitutional. I think about a couple of things that the British Parliament, things that they did that would be unthinkable in the United States. For example, once upon a time, Great Britain had an election in 1935. They were scheduled to have another election in 1940. And when World War II broke out, the conservatives said that we're going to stay here, that we should suspend elections till the war is over, with the understanding that when World War II is over, elections will resume. And they did that. And of course, World War II ended in 1945. And a couple months after the election was over, after the war was over, there was an election. Contrast that with the United States. We had an election in 1864, right in the middle of a civil war. On another occasion, the Parliament outlawed the London City Council for several months. Once again, that would be unthinkable in the United States for the national government to declare a political institution, a county government or a city government, unconstitutional. So in Great Britain, if Parliament passes a law, it is the law. And the only way it can be overturned is if the Parliament itself overturns a previous law. In the United States, if a law is passed, the Supreme Court might declare it unconstitutional, and that, again, does not exist in Britain. There is no court with judicial review. The second major idea and area where there is a huge difference between Britain and the United States. So the first one was in the U.S. there's constitutional supremacy. In Britain there's parliamentary supremacy. In the United States we have a federal system. In Great Britain has a unitary system. So that is the second major idea. Britain has a unitary system. This is very, very common. I would underline this. Great Britain is like 90% of countries in the world that have a unitary system. That means that the national government wields all power and authority. Now, don't misunderstand what this means. That does not mean that there aren't local governments. There are in Britain and in other unitary systems. It doesn't even mean that those local governments aren't powerful. In some unitary systems, local governments are powerful. But in a unitary system, what that means is that regional and local governments are given their power by the national government, and therefore the powers of local and regional governments can be amended or taken away by the national government. That's not true in the United States. The United States is one of approximately 20 countries in the world. I think it's a little bit more than that now, but about 10%, a little over that. I think the last time I looked, it's like 11.2 or 11.3% of countries are federal. I round it off into even numbers and just say 10%. The United States has a federal system where there is a constitutional division of power between the national government and the states. Or in the United States, there are some powers that only the national government has, like declaring war or coining money. There's some powers that both the national government and the states have, like taxation, like court systems. And then there are some powers that only the states have, like ratifying a constitutional amendment or conducting elections, which certainly was very, very controversial in the last presidential election. The third major difference between the British system and the American presidential system is in the United States we have separation of powers and checks and balances. In Britain they have fusion of powers. In Great Britain, the chief executive, the prime minister, as well as cabinet members, there are about 100 members of the House of Commons that also serve in the executive branch as a cabinet minister or as a junior cabinet minister. In the United States, this is specifically forbidden. In the United States, because of separation of powers, Executive officers cannot also serve in the Congress. That's illegal. For example, our Vice President, Kamala Harris, was one of our senators here in California. She was in the legislature in the U.S. Senate. And in order to become vice president, she first had to resign her former office, being a senator representing California. In Great Britain, the executive officers are still members of the House of Commons. So they are an executive officer and they are also a legislative officer at the same time. In other words, executive and legislative powers are fused, and individuals can serve in both. In the case of the United States, cabinet members cannot serve in the legislature. They cannot serve in the judicial branch of government while they're an executive officer. Now, obviously, people can move from one institution at a time. I just gave you the example of Harris being a senator and then becoming a vice president. You can have an ex-president. For example, William Howard Taft was once president. After he left the presidency, he later became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. John Quincy Adams, after he was president, later became a member of the House of Representatives. They just cannot do it at the same time. The fourth one, and I'll talk about this in a lot more detail later when I get to the cabinet and the prime minister, but this is collective responsibility, and I want to introduce this because here's another difference with the American presidential system. Collective responsibility is really a management tool that the prime minister exercises over the cabinet. So the prime minister selects cabinet members. He or she can hire them, can fire them. And cabinet members are expected to publicly support the policies of the prime minister or resign. And it's tough to resign because the cabinet is where future prime ministers are going to be selected. So if you want to become prime minister someday, you really need experience serving in the cabinet. So it is a plum job. There may be 17 to 24 people in a given prime minister's tenure that serve in the cabinet. So it is very, very prestigious. And as I will mention later, British cabinet secretaries are far more powerful than American cabinet secretaries. The last major distinction in the 2 minutes or so that I have left is that while both America and Great Britain are both considered two-party systems, certainly Roskin makes this claim, your textbook author, I would modify that. There's no question that America, the United States, has a dominant two-party system, the Democrats and Republicans. Everyone elected, I believe, since 1852, an American president has been either a Democrat or a Republican. And with rare exception, you're not going to see third parties represented in the Senate or in the House of Representatives. Britain, like the United States, has two dominant political parties, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. However, unlike the United States, there are several regional nationalist parties. There is a significant one in Scotland that runs as the Scottish Nationalist Party. They are a significant party. There's a Welsh Nationalist Party. There's even a Democratic Unionist Party that represents Northern Ireland. There is also a third party that has gone by several names, the Liberal Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Alliance, etc., that has garnered a lot of support in general elections. So while the United States is considered a strict two-party system by the academics, if I ask you this question on the exam according to Randall, Britain has a blank party system. Your answer is going to be a 2+ party system. And over the last decade, Britain has had two coalition governments where a major party has had to cut a deal with a minor party in order to govern, which I think is the best the best example of why I believe Britain is a two-plus party system. In the next mini lecture, I will talk about the British monarch. Have a wonderful day.